Hello, Sean Munger again. I'm that history guy. You know who I am, you know what I do. I teach history courses online, and I deal with historical subjects here on YouTube. This is the last in a series of 4 videos I've made about Oak Island, which is a small island in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia in Canada, where people have been searching for buried treasure for about 150 years. In reality, there is no treasure on Oak Island, and there never was. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, there's 3 that precede this one. I recommend you go back and watch them. This series is itself, the series of 4 is itself a part of a larger series I call Historical Thoughts, where I use the processes of history and the tools of historians to weed through various fakes, scams, and false impressions about the past. In the first video, I explained the nature of the Oak Island legend and the first of the 4 main reasons why we know it's not true, why we know there's no treasure there, mainly the flood tunnels that have never been found. In the second video, I explained why there's no physical evidence of a treasure pit, there's no treasure infrastructure there, and what the supposed box drains or finger drains actually are. They're not part of a treasure operation. In the third video, I showed you why the documentary historical evidence of the early treasure hunts is lacking. And it's from these early hunts where most of the key pieces of convincing are done. This is personally my favorite part of the puzzle. There's a very serious logic problem at the heart of the whole Oak Island legend, and it's one that people don't really talk about very much. I was reading about this legend for years before I realized that this logic problem was there. And it alone virtually proves that the treasure isn't there. Let's assume for the sake of argument that I've been wrong, totally wrong in these past 3 videos, and that the legend is substantially true. That there was a treasure pit, that there are flood tunnels, box drains, all of that stuff. So just assume I'm wrong. This would be a work of engineering of immense complexity, and it would take a lot of technical skill and a lot of money to construct it. This reasoning is usually trotted out right before a statement like, well, whatever must be there must be really, really valuable. But think about this. If somebody went to all this trouble to build a treasure trap preventing anyone else from getting it, the chances are virtually 0 that they would have forgotten to come back for it. So think about it. Why would someone, a pirate perhaps, want to bury treasure in the first place? You don't bury treasure and just leave it in the ground forever. That's not the point. You bury it until some temporary danger of discovery or confiscation passes, and then you go back to fetch it. Anyone who digs for treasure on Oak Island makes 2 assumptions. First, that a treasure of immense value was buried there, but secondly, that it's still there, that whoever buried it either forgot about it or was somehow prevented from coming back to retrieve it. The evidence, or lack thereof, shows that assumption 1, that a treasure was ever there at all, is on very, very shaky ground to begin with. But assumption 2, that whoever buried it would have either forgotten to come back for it or been prevented from coming back for it, that's worse than pure conjecture. It's just wishful thinking. There is nothing behind it. So, use your common sense here. Isn't it illogical to go to the immense trouble and expense of creating such an elaborate trap to guard something that was worth abandoning? Of course it is. It's illogical. And the more valuable the treasure was in the first place, the more motivation you'd have to go back and fetch it. Thus, whoever built the treasure trap is virtually guaranteed to have sailed back to the island at some point to collect their treasure. So consider this. Assume someone did bury treasure there and set all these exotic booby traps. They would have to come back to get the treasure. And if whoever came back for it didn't care whether anyone knew that there was once treasure buried there, they would have just left a big raw open hole in the ground and just forgotten about it because, why bother? Obviously, that wasn't the case. If it was, somebody would have gone to Oak Island and found a big empty hole there, filled with seawater, of course, and they'd scratch their head and say, gee, I wonder what was buried here. But we know that didn't happen. This means, logically, that not only did the people who supposedly buried the treasure definitely come back for it, but they also wanted, for whatever reason, to conceal the fact that treasure had ever been buried there. To do that, they would have fetched the treasure, then filled in the hole but presumably left the flood tunnels open or destroyed the mechanism that closed them, so that anyone that came after them would never be able to prove with certainty that something had once been there. As you know, I don't believe that there was ever a treasure pit of any kind on Oak Island, but if I'm wrong, and there was, this has to be why no one has ever found it after nearly 200 years of searching. Hence, we end up at the same finish line. There's nothing down there, and you're wasting your time. If you think about it, Oak Island is a pretty odd place to stash one of the world's greatest treasures. No persuasive explanation for why the possessors of vast wealth that they needed to hide chose this particular spot to hide it. No evidence of that has ever been offered. There's no shortage of wild theories, though, of course, none of which make really much sense. This book, the Finian Book, goes particularly nuts with exotic theories about what supposedly is down there. Finian, the author of this book, proclaims triumphantly, without any evidence, that the treasure must be the original manuscripts of Shakespeare's plays, which weren't written by Shakespeare, of course, but actually by Francis Bacon, which itself is a ludicrous theory. People love to suppose that the Knights Templar or the Freemasons were involved, despite not a speck of evidence that they were. Umberto Eco, in his novel Foucault's Pendulum, satirized the tendency to put the Knights Templar at the center of any historical mystery. It's very silly, very, very silly. So back in the realm of reality, the other piece of the logic puzzle of Oak Island, and something else that no one talks about, is the lack of evidence from the point of view of whoever actually buried the treasure. An operation of that magnitude, if it is as people say it is, would have taken a huge amount of manpower, substantial time, and expense. There would be records of this. There'd be payrolls, engineers, supply requisitions, ship voyages, that kind of thing. These records were kept in the 18th century. There's been no hint of them since then. Even true believers in the legend concede that it couldn't realistically be pirates or other rogue elements who would generally lack the technical and logistical sophistication to pull off the kind of operation that they insist must have been there. Pirates were cutthroats and brigands, and they had very loose control over their men. They would not have spent weeks digging tunnels on a distant island for what? Why would they have done that? But there's no such evidence at all for anyone having mounted this kind of operation. The theory presented in this book, as you remember, this is the Encyclopedia of Unsolved Mysteries that sparked my initial interest in this case. The theory presented in this book is that the British buried pay chests for their army there during the Revolutionary War about 1780. This is utter rubbish. The British paid colonial troops in paper money, not in gold, and in any event, British archives would be full of telltale clues that this sort of operation had occurred. The British are really great at keeping records and notoriously bad at suppressing them. So even decades later, after the Revolutionary War was over and no one stood anything to gain by continued secrecy, why keep it a secret anymore? Somebody would have come forward with a story to the effect of, oh yeah, I was part of the original Oak Island operation. Here's what happened. But there's been nothing to this effect at all. Nothing. You simply can't keep a secret on this order for so long. To believe otherwise gets into the realm of conspiracy theory, and don't even get me started on why those never make any sense. So what did happen? As I've said several times now, Oak Island is a scam. Secret buried treasure was a common bit of folklore in the early 19th century. And there are documented ones in Nova Scotia before 1850. There's documented rumors of treasure in various other places. I think someone, possibly in the 1840s, heard a tall tale or some kind of local folklore about a mysterious island in Mahone Bay. Perhaps a local came up with it and decided for some easy cash to hoodwink some investors into financing a treasure hunt. The legends of previous treasure hunts were necessary to reinforce the "it's just out of reach" narrative, and the nonsense about the link of the gold chain or the metal in pieces theory or whatever, both of which supposedly date from the 1849 gig, were invented to lay it on just a little bit thicker. Someone may have planted fake clues around the islands, or discovering remnants of salt works, which may have happened, roped that into the theory as proof. We know that the salt works have been conflated into the legend of the treasure, so it was easy enough to find that quote-unquote evidence and then convince people, oh, look, that's evidence of the treasure dig. But the thing is, this scam kept paying off long after its initial conception. Over the years, new generations of scammers, probably unknown to the original ones, hijacked the legend and then reappropriated it for a new treasure hunt to fleece new victims. Then by the 20th century, the legend had a life of its own, sustaining itself without the involvement of scammers by seducing innocent people who really do believe that there's treasure there to spend their lives and lots of money to go get it. To address one final point, which is, what's the harm in believing that there's treasure there? Well, there is harm. Real people have died in the quest for this non-existent booty. People have wasted their lives and their fortunes, sometimes for decades, on a pointless obsession with this legend. So to ask what's the harm in believing, I suggest you pose that question to the families of the people who have died searching for this treasure. Incidentally, many people in the 19th century believed that Oak Island was a scam from the word go. One of the earliest newspaper articles about the phenomenon, dated 1861, is a debunking of it, labeling the whole thing the Oak Island folly. This is in 1861. Scams rarely go unchallenged. If people were denouncing Oak Island as a scam more than 150 years ago, when, if it was genuine, the trail of documentary evidence would have been much fresher than it is today, this is a telltale sign that the whole thing was simply a hoax. So we can say definitively, there is no treasure on Oak Island. There never has been. All the money spent to find it over the last 200 years has been utterly wasted. So, thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.